This episode is based on the case of Clark Rockefeller. You want to hear something that completely blew my mind? I found this story about a guy who convinced people he came from one of the richest families in America. And honestly, if you met him, you probably would have believed him too. He was intelligent, well spoken, educated, confident. Everything about him fit the image, except none of it was even true. So, this story revolves around a man who introduced himself as Clark Rockefeller. Just hearing the last name immediately changes how people see you. People hear Rockefeller and they start filling in the blanks themselves: wealth, power, old money, influence, and apparently Clark understood that very well. The strange part is, he didn't just tell people his name was Rockefeller. He built an entire life around it. Different careers, different addresses, different stories, and different identities. The more I read about this guy, the more I felt like he wasn't pretending to be someone else. He was constantly becoming someone else. Honestly, that's what fascinated me because most people tell lies to hide one thing. Clark seemed to build entire personalities. He wasn't changing little details. He was changing the entire identity depending on where life took him. Imagine meeting someone, becoming friends with them, working with them, maybe even marrying them, and realizing years later you've never actually known their real name. That's unsettling. Apparently, even people who spent years around him described him as intelligent, charming, and incredibly believable. Nothing about him screamed, "This person is lying." If anything, he made people feel like they were the ones who didn't know enough. And that's something I notice in a lot of these stories. Confidence is incredibly persuasive. Sometimes people don't believe someone because the story makes sense. They believe them because the person telling it never seems to doubt themselves. For years, Clark moved through different circles, introducing himself as different versions of himself. And somehow, people accepted him, not because the lies were perfect, but because they were delivered with absolute certainty. That honestly made me stop and think, how many assumptions do we make about people simply because they appear confident? Eventually, though, things started falling apart. After his marriage ended, a custody dispute over his daughter brought investigators much closer to his past. Once people started pulling one loose thread, everything unraveled. Apparently, Clark Rockefeller wasn't Clark Rockefeller at all. His real name was Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter, a German immigrant who had spent decades creating false identities and reinventing himself. That reveal alone feels like something out of a movie, but the story doesn't end there. As investigators dug deeper into his past, they connected him to the 1985 disappearance of a man named John Sohus in California. Years later, Sohus's remains were discovered, and authorities ultimately charged Christian with his murder. What began as a bizarre story about a fake identity turned into a homicide investigation spanning decades. That's the part that stayed with me. Not just that he lied, it's how he completely seemed to disappear into the people he invented. Because after a while, I started wondering, does he even know who he really was anymore? Or had he spent so many years performing different versions of himself that the performance became all that was left? There's something deeply unsettling about realizing that someone can build an entire life on confidence, charm, and invented stories, and almost nobody questions it. It makes you wonder how often we mistake confidence for truth, or familiarity for honesty, or assume that because someone looks the part, they must actually be who they say they are. I think that's what makes this story stick with people. Not just the deception, the realization that someone can sit across from you for years and you may never actually know who they are. I'm curious what you think. Do you think most people would recognize someone living a completely false identity? Or do you think we're much more likely to believe a convincing story than we'd ever want to admit?